Part 1. The Descent into Silence. The Earth does not forget. It swallows, it hides, and it heals, but it never truly forgets. Deep beneath the rolling hills of modern-day France, under the golden wheat fields that sway in the gentle breeze of a quiet afternoon, lies a scar that refused to close. For over a century, a tomb of timber and mud remained sealed, a time capsule of terror frozen at the exact moment the world ended for the men trapped inside. This is not just a story of a battle. This is an invitation to descend into the darkness where the clock stopped in 1917, and the echoes of the fallen still whisper through the lime-caked soil. Chapter 1. The Iron Tomb. They called it the Labyrinth of the Lost. While the history books focus on the grand maneuvers of generals in far-off chateaus, the reality of the Great War was measured in inches, sweat, and the suffocating smell of damp earth. In a remote sector of the Western Front, away from the celebrated victories, sat a trench system known as Kilometer 21. It was a place where the geography of death was mapped out in jagged zigzags and waterlogged craters. Imagine, if you can, the weight of the air. It is heavy, tasting of rusted metal and stale tobacco. To look over the parapet is to invite a bullet. To look down is to see your own reflection in a pool of stagnant, gray water. The men here didn't live, they endured. They were the inhabitants of a subterranean world, caught between a sky that rained fire and an earth that craved their bones. Then, the barrage began. Not the usual morning hate of sporadic shells, but a drumfire, a rhythmic, unrelenting tectonic shift. The Germans called it Trommelfeuer. It was a sound that didn't just hurt the ears, it vibrated the marrow in your bones. For the soldiers of the 124th Infantry, the world was no longer made of wood and wire. It was made of vibration. Every explosion felt like a giant's fist slamming into the roof of their dugout, shaking dust from the beams like hourglass sand marking the seconds of their lives. Among them was Private Elias Thorne. He was 19, though his eyes looked 50. In his pocket, a letter to a girl in Sussex remained unsealed. He sat on a wooden crate, his fingers white-knuckled around the stock of his Lee Enfield. Beside him, Sergeant Miller, a man who had survived the Somme by sheer spite, didn't pray. He just watched the ceiling. He knew the sound of a structural failure. He knew when the earth was tired of holding its breath. The shell that ended it all didn't make a whistling sound. It was a heavy, subsonic roar, a 21 centimeters howitzer projectile that found the exact weakness in the chalk-lined ceiling of the main dugout. In a fraction of a heartbeat, the support beams snapped like dry twigs. The air was sucked out of the room, replaced by a wall of cascading soil and stone. No screams, no heroic last words. Just the heavy, muffled thud of 1,000 tons of French soil reclaiming its own. The lights, flickering candles stuck to bayonets, went out. And for the next 109 years, there was only silence. Chapter 2. The Modern Resurrection. Fast forward to the present day. We see a team of archaeologists, not in a desert searching for gold, but in a muddy field with ground-penetrating radar. They were looking for a lost drainage pipe, but the screen showed something different. A void. A perfect, rectangular pocket of air deep beneath the surface. They expected a collapsed tunnel. They expected debris. What they found was a portal. As the mechanical excavators peeled back the layers of time, the smell hit them first. It wasn't the scent of decay that had long since passed. It was the scent of preservation. The unique chemical composition of the clay had acted as a vacuum seal. When the first camera was lowered through a borehole, the monitors in the surface tent flickered to life, revealing a sight that made seasoned historians weep. There, in the grainy light of the LED probe, was a table. On that table sat a half-eaten tin of bully beef and a bottle of wine, its cork still intact. A pair of spectacles rested next to a folded newspaper dated March 1917. It looked as though the occupants had simply stepped out for a moment. But as the camera panned left, the reality set in. The boots were still there, rows of them, peeking out from the collapsed chalk. Some were upright, others were tangled in a desperate, final struggle. This wasn't a ruin. It was a photograph in 3 dimensions. The echoes of ages are often metaphorical, but here, they were physical. Every object, every button, every scrap of leather told a story of a Tuesday morning that never ended. The archaeologists began the delicate process of the Great Unearthing. Using brushes no larger than a fingernail, They removed the dust of a century from the faces of the fallen. They found Elias Thorne. He was still sitting on his crate, his skeletal hand still resting where the letter to Sussex had been tucked. The paper was yellowed but legible. The ink had faded, but the longing remained. "Dearest Martha," it began. "The mud is the worst part. You cannot imagine how much I miss the dry heat of the kitchen." Elias never got to finish that sentence. The earth had cut him off mid-thought. As the team worked, the sky above the trench turned gray, mirroring the photos from 1917. It was as if the trench itself was resisting the light of the modern world, clinging to its secrets. But the secrets were out. And as the researchers moved deeper into the labyrinth of the lost, they realized that the main dugout was only the beginning. There was a door at the end of the hall, reinforced with iron straps, still bolted from the inside. What were they trying to keep out? Or more chillingly, what were they trying to keep in? Part 2. The Whispering Chalk. The iron-strapped door didn't groan when it opened. It yielded with a dry, papery snap of petrified wood. As the flashlights cut through the century-old stagnant air, the beams didn't find a storehouse or a command post. They found a listening gallery. These were the narrow, claustrophobic tunnels driven deep into no man's land, where men sat in absolute silence with stethoscopes pressed to the earth, listening for the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of German miners digging beneath their feet. In the Great War, the most terrifying enemy wasn't the one you could see through a trench periscope. It was the one you could only hear. Under the sector of Kilometer 21, a silent war of nerves was fought in the dark. If you heard the digging stop, it meant one of two things. The enemy had finished their mine and were about to blow you to high heaven, or they had heard you and were waiting with a revolver at the thin wall of clay between your lives. Chapter 3. The Ghost in the Wire. The archaeology team found Corporal Arthur Penhaligon in that listening gallery. He was slumped against the chalk wall, his skeleton perfectly preserved in a sitting position. In his hand, he still clutched a primitive acoustic amplifier. But as the researchers cleared the debris around him, they noticed something chilling. Penhaligon wasn't facing the enemy lines. He was facing the ceiling, his jaw locked in a permanent silent scream of realization. The records of the 124th Infantry mention Penhaligon. He was a stumper, a former tin miner from Cornwall, recruited specifically for his ability to read the language of the rocks. His last log entry, recovered from a waterlogged satchel, was dated only hours before the collapse. The handwriting is erratic, the graphite pressing so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. "They aren't digging under us anymore," the note read. "They're digging around us. I can hear them in the walls. Not shovels. Not picks. Something faster. Something heavier. The earth is screaming, and no one above will listen." What did Penhaligon hear in those final hours? Was it the precursor to the massive mine explosion that eventually swallowed the sector, or was it the sound of his own mind fracturing under the pressure of the deep? To understand the brutal reality of this forgotten trench, one must understand the psychological toll of the subterranean. Above ground, you could run. You could hide in a shell hole. But here, 40 feet down, you were in a wooden box waiting for the world to collapse. The men of Kilometer 21 didn't just suffer from shell shock, they suffered from tomb sickness. Every creak of a support beam was a death sentence. Every trickle of falling dust was a countdown. The team moved further into the gallery, discovering a countermine, a tunnel dug by the British to intercept the German path. Here, the preservation was even more haunting. They found a German shovel, its blade chipped, leaning against a British sandbag. The two sides had been so close they could hear each other breathing through the vents. At one point, only 3 feet of soft chalk separated two men who had never met, but whose sole purpose was to annihilate the other. Chapter 4. The Anatomy of an Ambush. As the excavation continued, a new pattern emerged. This wasn't just a collapsed trench, it was a site of a desperate, final stand. Near the western egress, the team uncovered a pile of spent brass casings, hundreds of them, stacked in a neat pile. This wasn't the work of a chaotic explosion. This was the mark of a Lewis gunner who had stayed behind, firing until the very end to cover a retreat that never happened. Why didn't they retreat? The maps from the era show a clear communication trench leading back to the secondary line, but when the archaeologists cleared that path, they found it hadn't been collapsed by shells. It had been blocked. Intentional barricades of wire and timber had been erected from the inside. The men of the 124th hadn't been trapped by the enemy, they had been sealed in by their own command. The sacrifice order, a term whispered in the dark corners of military history. When a sector was deemed lost, but its continued occupation was necessary to stall an enemy advance, the order would be given, hold at all costs. In the brutal logic of 1917, all costs meant every single life in the trench. The men in the main dugout likely knew they were the bait. They knew the tunnels behind them were being filled with earth to prevent the Germans from using them to breach the main line. The artifacts found near the barricade tell a story of desperation. We find trench art, shell casings carved with intricate patterns of roses and hearts, abandoned next to bags of grenades. We find a small, wooden crucifix, its edges smoothed by the frantic rubbing of a thumb. The men knew. As the German drumfire intensified, and the exits were filled with dirt by their own brothers in arms, they prepared for the end not as soldiers, but as ghosts in waiting. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Eris Thorne, no relation to Elias, though the coincidence chilled the team, picked up a small, rusted object from the mud. It was a whistle. The standard-issue officer's whistle used to signal a charge over the top. But this whistle was crushed, flattened by a weight no human could withstand. It serves as a grim symbol. In the forgotten trench, there was no over the top. There was only under the earth. But as the sun began to set over the excavation site, and the team prepared to seal the sector for the night, a sensor in the listening gallery triggered. A rhythmic vibration. Thud, thud, thud. The team froze. The machines were off. The wind was still. The sound was coming from deeper down. From the section of the tunnel they hadn't yet reached. The section that, according to the maps, shouldn't exist. Part 3. The Echoes of the Abyss. In the silence of the modern French countryside, that rhythmic thud felt like a heartbeat, a ghost pulse from a war that refused to stay buried. The archaeology team stood paralyzed. Rationality says it's settling earth, the shifting of limestone under the weight of a century. But in the labyrinth of the lost, rationality is the first thing to suffocate. They weren't just digging into dirt, they were digging into a collective trauma that had been pressurized for over 100 years. Dr. Thorne ordered a seismic microphone lowered into the newly discovered void. As the headphones went on, the static cleared to reveal a sound that defied geological explanation. It wasn't the sharp crack of breaking stone. It was a wet, heavy dragging sound, the sound of something, or some memory, refusing to be still. To find the source, they had to go deeper, past the secondary support beams, into the Black Gallery. Chapter 5. The Toll of the Deep. The Black Gallery was never meant for soldiers. It was a sap, a narrow, unventilated tunnel pushed out into the no-man's land of the underworld. Here, the walls weren't reinforced with timber. They were raw chalk, carved by hand in the flickering light of tallow candles. The air here was so thin that a match wouldn't strike. The men who worked these saps, the clay kickers, lived in a state of constant hypoxia, their minds hallucinating in the oxygen-starved dark. As the team breached the final wall of the gallery, the flashlights revealed a chamber that hadn't been on any British or German map. It was a collision point. This was the nightmare scenario of the Great War. Two tunnels, one Allied and one Central Power, had accidentally broken into each other. But there were no signs of a firefight. No spent shells. No bayonets. Instead, they found something far more haunting. They found them together. 4 British soldiers and 3 German pioneers, sitting in a circle. They weren't fighting. They were huddled. In the face of a massive overhead bombardment that had collapsed the exits for both sides, the uniforms had ceased to matter. The brutal reality of Kilometer 21 had stripped away the propaganda of empires, leaving only 7 men trapped in a shrinking pocket of air, waiting for the weight of the world to crush them. The artifacts in this chamber were shared. A German canteen lay next to a British mess tin. A deck of cards was spread out on a flat stone, a game of poker that was never finished, the stakes rendered irrelevant by the ticking clock of their remaining oxygen. It is a scene of profound, tragic humanity. In the heart of the most industrialized slaughter in history, these men chose a quiet, shared peace in their final hours. But why the noise? Why the vibration? As Dr. Thorne moved his light toward the back of the chamber, he found the source. A water pipe, part of a primitive pumping system, had been caught in a slow-moving underground spring. For 100 years, the water had been pulsing through the rusted iron, creating a mechanical thud that sounded like a shovel hitting dirt. A trick of physics. But for a moment, it had brought the terror of the Cornish miners back to life. Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. The discovery of the peace chamber changed the nature of the excavation. It was no longer just an archaeological find, it was a shrine. The team began the process of identifying the men. Among the Germans was a private named Hans Weber, a watchmaker from Bavaria. In his pocket, they found a small silver timepiece. It had stopped at exactly 10:14 a.m., the moment of the collapse. This is the true horror of the forgotten trench, the precision of its cruelty. The Great War didn't just kill, it erased. It took men from their homes and buried them so deeply that their families spent decades staring at names on stone walls, wondering where the body lay. For the descendants of Hans Weber and Elias Thorn, the echoes of ages were finally becoming voices. But as they catalogued the items, a disturbing pattern emerged. Many of the skeletons showed no signs of trauma from the collapse. They hadn't been crushed by the ceiling. They had died of something else. One by one, the forensic reports came back. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The black damp. The gas had seeped in from the heavy shells exploding above, settling in the low points of the trench. They didn't die in a flash of heat. They simply fell asleep in the dark. The team found a final logbook near the exit of the peace chamber. It wasn't a military record. It was a communal diary, written in both English and German. The final entry, written in a shaky hand, transcends language. The light is gone. The air is sweet. We are no longer enemies. We are only tired. It is a testament to the fact that even in the most brutal conditions imaginable, the human spirit seeks connection over conflict. As the artifacts were moved to the surface, the watches, the letters, the shared canteens, the trench began to feel different. The oppressive weight of the tomb sickness lifted, replaced by a somber, quiet reverence. But the earth wasn't finished giving up its dead. At the very bottom of the sump pit, under a layer of thick black sludge, the sensors picked up a massive metallic signature. It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't a tool. It was a Liven's projector, a large mortar-like weapon designed to fire canisters of lethal phosgene gas. And it was still loaded. The forgotten trench wasn't just a tomb, it was a ticking chemical time bomb, a final poisonous sting from a war that ended a century ago. The excavation, once a mission of memory, had suddenly become a race against a lethal legacy. Part 4. The Poisoned Breath. The air in the trench changed. It wasn't a physical shift. The oxygen sensors remained steady, but a psychological frost settled over the team. The discovery of the Liven's projector transformed the labyrinth of the lost from a historic sanctuary into a kill zone. This was the brutal reality of the Great War. Even in death, it remains lethal. A century of corrosion had turned the steel canister into a fragile eggshell, holding a concentrated lung-searing nightmare from 1917. Phosgene. A colorless gas that smells like musty hay. In the trenches, it was the silent executioner. Unlike chlorine, which burned the throat immediately, phosgene was insidious. You could breathe it in, feel a slight tickle, and think you were fine, only to collapse hours later as your lungs slowly filled with fluid. For the archaeology team, the echoes of ages had suddenly gained a sharp, chemical edge. Chapter 7. The Ghost in the Cylinder. The excavation ground to a halt. The gentle brushes and trowels were replaced by hazardous material suits and remote-controlled submersibles. As the team watched the monitors from the safety of the surface, the camera moved closer to the projector. The weapon was angled toward the German lines, frozen in the split second before its crew could pull the firing lanyard. It sat in the mud like a rusted predatory animal, its payload still waiting for a command that would never come. Why was it still here? The records of the 124th Infantry mentioned a specialist unit attached to the sector, the Royal Engineers Gas Companies. They were the pariahs of the front, men who handled the most hated weapons of the war. To the infantry, they were the poisoners. When the dugout collapsed, the gas crew was buried with their machines. They became the first victims of their own silence, trapped in a room where a single leak meant a slow, agonizing end. As the submersible cleared the silt from around the projector, it revealed a name scratched into the side of the barrel: Lulu. A soldier's grim attempt at domesticating a monster. Next to it, the remains of a specialized gas mask, not the standard cloth hood, but a heavy, rubberized respirator. It was clutched in the hands of a skeleton whose identity had been scoured away by the acidic damp of the sump pit. This man hadn't died from the collapse. The forensic imaging showed a different story. His ribs were flared, his posture one of a man struggling for every molecule of air. The brutal reality was becoming clearer. When the earth shook and the beams snapped, a seal had broken. Not a large leak, but a whisper of phosgene. While the men in the peace chamber fell asleep, the men in the gas sap died in a frantic blind panic, drowning on dry land. Chapter 8. The Archaeology of Fear. The presence of the gas changed the team's perspective on the artifacts. Every button, every letter, every trench art rose was now a potential carrier of contamination. The past wasn't just being unearthed, it was being decontaminated. But the danger didn't stop the fascination. Because beneath the gas projector, the sensors had found something else. A hidden floor, a false bottom, to the trench that wasn't part of any military blueprint. Below the level of the soldiers, below the level of the gas, sat a series of ancient, pre-war tunnels. The forgotten trench had been built on top of a medieval quarry. The soldiers of 1917 hadn't just been fighting each other. They had been inadvertently breaking into a subterranean world that had been silent for 500 years. The echoes of ages went deeper than the Great War. Dr. Thorne realized that the vibrations they had heard earlier, the thud thud thud, might not have just been the water pipe. The medieval tunnels were acting as a massive acoustic chamber, amplifying sounds from miles away. The tomb sickness of the soldiers was likely exacerbated by these phantom noises, the feeling that the very earth beneath them was hollow, shifting, and alive with the ghosts of a much older conflict. The team began to piece together the final hours of Kilometer 21. It was a symphony of horrors. Above, a relentless artillery barrage. Below, the sound of German miners. Within, the creeping fog of phosgene gas. And beneath it all, the terrifying groans of an ancient quarry collapsing under the weight of modern industrial warfare. It wasn't a battlefield, it was a meat grinder designed by the devil himself. In a small alcove near the false bottom, they found a stash of forbidden goods. It wasn't weapons or food. It was a collection of French civilian clothes, a map of the local railway, and a forged pass. Someone had been planning to vanish. In the face of certain death, the brutal reality had pushed a soldier to the ultimate act of defiance, desertion. But the earth had been faster than his feet. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the fourth day of the excavation, the hazmat team successfully neutralized the Liven's projector. The Lulu was lifted from the mud, a rusted husk of a nightmare. But as the weight was removed from the floor of the sump pit, the ground didn't hold. A new fissure opened, a jagged, black maw that led even deeper into the limestone. From the darkness of that new hole, a cold, stale wind began to blow. It carried the smell of wet stone and something metallic. The sensors on the team's suits began to spike. Not gas, not radiation, but a sound frequency that shouldn't exist in nature. A low, rhythmic humming that vibrated the very air they breathed. They had cleared the trench, but they had opened something that had been sealed for a reason. Part 5. The Resonance of the Abyss. The sound was not a noise, it was a physical pressure. It felt like a low-frequency hum that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the ribs. In the cramped, damp confines of the Black Gallery, the archaeology team stood frozen. The modern world, with its GPS, its LED lights, and its safety protocols, felt suddenly thin, a paper shale barrier against a darkness that had no name. The brutal reality of Kilometer 21 was shifting from a military tragedy into something far more primal. Dr. Thorne lowered a high-frequency acoustic sensor into the new fissure. On the monitor, the sound waves didn't look like the jagged spikes of a machine or the rhythmic thud of a pump. They looked like a heartbeat, slow, deep, and impossibly ancient. The echoes of ages were no longer just the sounds of 1917. They were the tectonic groans of a landscape that had been scarred by millions of tons of high explosives, now settling into its own hollowed-out bones. Chapter 9. The Hollow Earth. The medieval quarry beneath the trench wasn't just a series of rooms. It was a cathedral of absence. As the team's specialized drone descended, the cameras revealed pillars of uncarved limestone, 5 meters thick, holding up the weight of the entire Western Front. But these pillars were cracked. The massive mine war of 1916, where both sides blew craters the size of city blocks, had compromised the very foundations of the Earth. Then, the drone's light hit the floor of the lower cavern. It wasn't mud. It wasn't chalk. It was metal. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of duds, unexploded ordnance that had filtered down through the soft soil over a century like silt in a river. High-explosive howitzer rounds, gas canisters, and British plum pudding bombs lay in a tangled, rusted heap. The forgotten trench was sitting on a literal mountain of dormant fire. This was the iron harvest in its most concentrated, deadly form. For 100 years, the farmers above had plowed up shells, but here, in the dark, the harvest had never been gathered. The low humming sound, it was the wind whistling through the hollow casings of empty shells, a flute played by the ghost of the battlefield. But the danger was far from atmospheric. The shifting of the limestone meant that this massive cache of explosives was under increasing, unstable pressure. Among the shells, the drone spotted something that didn't belong. A rail car. A small, narrow-gauge trolley used by the German pioneer to transport their deadliest payloads. It was overturned, its wheels locked in rust. And pinned beneath it was a figure. Not a skeleton in a uniform, but a man who appeared almost mummified by the constant drip of calcium-rich water from the ceiling. He had been turned to stone, a literal statue of a soldier, preserved in the very moment he tried to sabotage the mine. Chapter 10. The Saboteur's Secret. Identification was impossible through a camera lens, but the equipment near the stone soldier told a story of high-stakes espionage. He carried a British wire cutter, a German Luger, and a French compass. He was a man of no man's land, a scout whose mission had been to navigate the labyrinth beneath the trenches and ensure the great mine never blew. But the brutal reality is that in the dark, there are no heroes, only victims of geometry. As the team analyzed the footage, they realized the stone soldier was holding a copper wire that led deep into the pile of unexploded shells. He wasn't just a casualty, he was a guardian. He had died trying to disconnect a secondary fuse, a failsafe, designed to level the entire sector if the primary trench was ever taken. If he had failed, the hills above would have been erased. If he had succeeded, he had bought the world 100 years of borrowed time. But the copper wire was taut. The shifting of the quarry floor was pulling it. The echoes of ages were now a countdown. Every millimeter the earth moved brought the wire closer to its breaking point, or its firing point. The archaeology mission had officially transitioned into a high-stakes EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, operation. The labyrinth of the lost was preparing for one final, thunderous word. Dr. Thorne stood in the command tent, watching the rain start to fall outside. Rain was the enemy. Water would seep into the fissures, lubricating the chalk, hastening the collapse. He looked at the photo of Elias Thorne, the boy who missed the dry heat of a kitchen. He realized that the boy's final resting place was about to become the epicenter of a blast that would be felt all the way to Amiens. "We have to go back down," Thorne whispered. The team looked at him in horror. To enter the Black Gallery now was suicide. But to leave it was to allow the brutal reality of 1917 to claim modern lives. The past was no longer behind them. It was rising up to meet them, fueled by a century of rusted chemical rage and the unstable heart of the stone soldier's final mission. As they prepped the heavy lift gear, a second vibration shook the ground. This one wasn't a hum. It was a crack, the sound of a medieval pillar finally giving way. Deep in the monitors, they saw the stone soldier move as the floor tilted. The copper wire stretched. A single spark in that chamber would turn the forgotten trench into a volcanic vent of phosgene and fire. Part 5. The Resonance of the Abyss. The sound was not a noise. It was a physical pressure. It felt like a low-frequency hum that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly against the ribs. In the cramped, damp confines of the Black Gallery, the archaeology team stood frozen. The modern world, with its GPS, its LED lights, and its safety protocols, felt suddenly thin, a paper shale barrier against a darkness that had no name. The brutal reality of Kilometer 21 was shifting from a military tragedy into something far more primal. Dr. Thorne lowered a high-frequency acoustic sensor into the new fissure. On the monitor, the sound waves didn't look like the jagged spikes of a machine or the rhythmic thud of a pump. They looked like a heartbeat, slow, deep, and impossibly ancient. The echoes of ages were no longer just the sounds of 1917. They were the tectonic groans of a landscape that had been scarred by millions of tons of high explosives, now settling into its own hollowed-out bones. Chapter 9. The Hollow Earth. The medieval quarry beneath the trench wasn't just a series of rooms. It was a cathedral of absence. As the team's specialized drone descended, the cameras revealed pillars of uncarved limestone, 5 meters thick, holding up the weight of the entire Western Front. But these pillars were cracked. The massive mine war of 1916, where both sides blew craters the size of city blocks, had compromised the very foundations of the Earth. Then, the drone's light hit the floor of the lower cavern. It wasn't mud. It wasn't chalk. It was metal. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of duds, unexploded ordnance that had filtered down through the soft soil over a century like silt in a river. High-explosive howitzer rounds, gas canisters, and British plum pudding bombs lay in a tangled, rusted heap. The forgotten trench was sitting on a literal mountain of dormant fire. This was the iron harvest in its most concentrated, deadly form. For 100 years, the farmers above had plowed up shells, but here, in the dark, the harvest had never been gathered. The low humming sound, it was the wind whistling through the hollow casings of empty shells, a flute played by the ghost of the battlefield. But the danger was far from atmospheric. The shifting of the limestone meant that this massive cache of explosives was under increasing, unstable pressure. Among the shells, the drone spotted something that didn't belong. A rail car. A small, narrow-gauge trolley used by the German pioneer to transport their deadliest payloads. It was overturned, its wheels locked in rust. And pinned beneath it was a figure. Not a skeleton in a uniform, but a man who appeared almost mummified by the constant drip of calcium-rich water from the ceiling. He had been turned to stone, a literal statue of a soldier, preserved in the very moment he tried to sabotage the mine. Chapter 10. The Saboteur's Secret. Identification was impossible through a camera lens, but the equipment near the stone soldier told a story of high-stakes espionage. He carried a British wire cutter, a German Luger, and a French compass. He was a man of no man's land, a scout whose mission had been to navigate the labyrinth beneath the trenches and ensure the great mine never blew. But the brutal reality is that in the dark, there are no heroes, only victims of geometry. As the team analyzed the footage, they realized the stone soldier was holding a copper wire that led deep into the pile of unexploded shells. He wasn't just a casualty, he was a guardian. He had died trying to disconnect a secondary fuse, a failsafe, designed to level the entire sector if the primary trench was ever taken. If he had failed, the hills above would have been erased. If he had succeeded, he had bought the world 100 years of borrowed time. But the copper wire was taut. The shifting of the quarry floor was pulling it. The echoes of ages were now a countdown. Every millimeter the earth moved brought the wire closer to its breaking point, or its firing point. The archaeology mission had officially transitioned into a high-stakes EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, operation. The labyrinth of the lost was preparing for one final, thunderous word. Dr. Thorne stood in the command tent, watching the rain start to fall outside. Rain was the enemy. Water would seep into the fissures, lubricating the chalk, hastening the collapse. He looked at the photo of Elias Thorne, the boy who missed the dry heat of a kitchen. He realized that the boy's final resting place was about to become the epicenter of a blast that would be felt all the way to Amiens. "We have to go back down," Thorne whispered. The team looked at him in horror. To enter the Black Gallery now was suicide. But to leave it was to allow the brutal reality of 1917 to claim modern lives. The past was no longer behind them. It was rising up to meet them, fueled by a century of rusted chemical rage and the unstable heart of the stone soldier's final mission. As they prepped the heavy lift gear, a second vibration shook the ground. This one wasn't a hum. It was a crack, the sound of a medieval pillar finally giving way. Deep in the monitors, they saw the stone soldier move as the floor tilted. The copper wire stretched. A single spark in that chamber would turn the forgotten trench into a volcanic vent of phosgene and fire. Part 6. The Final Watch. The descent was no longer a walk into history. It was a descent into a throat of jagged chalk and rusted iron. As Dr. Thorne and a skeleton crew of EOD specialists lowered themselves back into the Black Gallery, the very walls seemed to breathe against them. The humidity had spiked to 90%. The smell of musty hay, the ghost of phosgene, clung to their respirators like a physical weight. Every step was a gamble against a century of structural fatigue. They reached the fissure that led to the stone soldier's tomb. The low-frequency hum had been replaced by a high-pitched metallic shrieking, the sound of the copper wire under extreme tension. Below them, the mountain of unexploded ordnance sat in a chaotic heap, 100 years of chemical decay ready to ignite. If the brutal reality of the Great War was industrial slaughter, the reality of this moment was industrial instability. Chapter 11. The Anatomy of a Sacrifice. Through the thermal imaging goggles, the stone soldier didn't look like a statue. He looked like a heat sink, a cold void in the center of the earth. As the EOD lead, a veteran of Sarajevo named Sergeant Major Vance, approached the wire, he stopped. "It's not just a fuse," he crackled over the comms. "It's a dead man's switch. If the wire snaps, the detonator triggers. If we cut it wrong, the charge completes the circuit." The soldiers of 1917 had built a trap that outlived their cause. They hadn't just wanted to hold the trench. They had wanted to ensure that if they fell, the earth would fall with them. The team looked at the stone soldier. He hadn't been a saboteur trying to stop the blast. He had been the sentinel, the man whose job it was to hold the wire steady while his comrades evacuated. He had stayed behind, pinned by the trolley, holding the life of the entire sector in his freezing hands until the oxygen ran out. The echoes of ages were suddenly very personal. This man, this nameless calcified ghost, had spent 100 years in a silent, agonizing vigil. His muscles had turned to stone, but his grip on that wire had never faltered. He was the ultimate expression of the Great War's demand for duty above all else. He was the anchor of Kilometer 21, a man who had refused to let the world blow apart even as his own world ended. Vance reached out with a pair of non-sparking ceramic shears. The tension in the wire was so high it vibrated like a violin string. Outside, the French rain was turning into a deluge, the water weight pressing down through the wheat fields, through the clay, into the very ceiling of the gallery. A single drop of water hit the wire. Ping. The sound echoed through the hollow shells like a gunshot. "Steady," Thorne whispered. He looked at the stone soldier's face. In the harsh light of the headlamps, the calcium deposits looked like tears frozen on a cheek. For a moment, the distance between the modern scientists and the ancient warrior vanished. They were all just men in a hole, terrified of the fire, praying for the light. The brutal reality wasn't the war itself. It was the fact that the war never truly ends. It just waits for someone to trip the wire. Chapter 12. The Severing of the Cord. The process of neutralizing the dead man's switch took 4 hours. 4 hours of holding one's breath in a tomb filled with gas and high explosives. Every time the earth shifted, the team froze, listening to the chalk crumble. They found the secondary detonator buried inside a crate of German potato masher grenades. It was a masterpiece of crude, effective engineering, a spring-loaded striker held back by the very copper wire the stone soldier had guarded. "On 3, Vance said. The shears closed around the wire. 1. Thorne thought of Elias and his letter to Sussex. 2. He thought of the peace chamber, where enemies had died as friends. 3. The snap was almost silent. The wire went limp. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. No explosion. No wall of fire. Just the sound of the rain dripping into the sump pit. The tension broke, but the danger wasn't over. The removal of the stone soldier was the team's final duty. They couldn't leave him here, pinned under a trolley in a mountain of duds. As they lifted the rail car using hydraulic jacks, the soldier's calcified hand finally let go of the wire. Underneath him, they found a small, rusted locket. Inside was no photo, but a pressed flower, a poppy, ironically enough, and a date, August 1914. He had carried the beginning of the war into the end of his life. As they moved his remains toward the surface, the forgotten trench seemed to lose its malice. The echoes of ages began to fade into the background noise of the modern world. They had dismantled the trap, but they had also dismantled the silence. The story of Kilometer 21 was no longer a secret kept by the Earth. It was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute, subterranean horror. But as the last man stepped out of the black gallery and into the rising sun of the French morning, a final tremor shook the field. The medieval quarry, its pillars finally pushed beyond their limit by the excavation and the rain, began to fold in on itself. The labyrinth of the lost was closing its doors for the last time. The team watched from the safety of the perimeter as the ground in the center of the field sank 6 feet in a slow, graceful sigh. Part 7. The Final Breath. The earth fell with a heavy, hollow sigh. Where the labyrinth of the lost had once held its breath for a century, there was now only a shallow depression in a field of wheat. The brutal reality of Kilometer 21 was finally settled. The gas was neutralized, the explosives buried deeper than any plow could reach, and the stone soldier was no longer a prisoner of the dark. The war, in this tiny corner of France, was finally over. But what remains of a place where time stood still? We are left with the artifacts, a half-written letter, a shared canteen, and a rusted whistle. These are not just relics. They are the physical debris of human souls caught in the gears of an industrial nightmare. They remind us that history isn't found in the ink of textbooks, but in the damp chalk of a collapsed dugout, where the difference between an enemy and a brother was only the color of a tunic and the direction of a tunnel. Conclusion. The unending echo. As the sun sets over the French horizon, casting long golden shadows across the scars of the Western Front, we realize that the echoes of ages never truly fade. They simply wait for us to listen. The men of the 124th Infantry and their German counterparts are no longer trapped in the silence of the Black Gallery. Their stories have been breathed back into the light, a haunting testament to the cost of a world gone mad. We walk upon their graves every day, unaware that beneath our feet, the past is still holding its breath, waiting to be remembered. The trench is gone, reclaimed by the roots of the wheat and the slow crawl of the seasons. But the lesson of Kilometer 21 remains etched in the spirit of all who seek the truth behind the wire. In the end, the earth does not forget, and neither should we. Closing credits and CTA. Thank you for descending into the darkness with us. If you felt the weight of the labyrinth of the lost, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to Echoes of Ages. The history of the Great War is deeper than you think. What other forgotten sectors should we unearth? Let us know in the comments below. And for more cinematic journeys into the scars of our past, click the notification bell. Until the next echo, stay curious and never forget the cost of the silence.